can begin. Good morning, everyone. I am Gergana Halpern on behalf of the education program at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights here at Columbia University. I'd like to welcome you all to our panel discussion on the Taliban takeover, women's rights, and the humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan. I would like to extend special thanks to Nazila Jamshidi for convening this panel. Nazila is a first-year graduate student from Afghanistan who is pursuing her degree in the Human Rights Studies MA program at Columbia. We are very grateful to Nazila and to our esteemed panel today for engaging in a conversation around these critical issues and for sharing your expertise with Columbia's human rights community. And with that, I will pause here and I will turn it over to Nazila, who will introduce our panel. Over to you, Nazila.
Thank you, Gergana. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for investing your time with us this Friday morning. My name is Nazila Jamshidi, and like all of you, I'm concerned about Afghans' return back into the dark era of 1990s. Today, we have an important panel on two current and tragic events in Afghanistan: women's human rights, which have been vanished considerably since the Taliban takeover, and the humanitarian catastrophe which is unfolding in Afghanistan with a harsh winter looming. So we have a remarkable panelist with us today, and they have been engaged with Afghans' women's rights, empowerment, and helping them change the laws and policies that could protect their human rights and their role in the society since 20 years ago, I should say. So we all know that devastation is enormous. Many gains have already been destroyed. Challenges are massive, and Afghanistan has turned into a disturbing reality that many of us are having a hard time to accept it. So through this panel, we expect to discuss some potential steps, some like realistic applicable step that can be taken to realize some basic women's rights, such as access to education and work, and the laws that can protect them from the modern slavery, which has already been approaching them very quickly. Also, I understand we had a good number of activists here in this meeting who are eager to learn a little bit more about the types of activism they should focus on to realize some rights and reduce the crisis. So with no further ado, I want to pass it to Professor Daniel Vigeland, a faculty fellow with Georgetown University's Conflict Resolution Program and a development practitioner with years of engagement in researching, teaching, and working on the ground on issues related to Afghanistan development. So Professor Vigeland, over to you.
Thank you, Nazila. You are too kind, as I am clearly not qualified to be moderating this distinguished panel of experts and advocates. But you know, when a former student asks for help, one is duty bound to sign up, even if it's not right in an objective sense. So obviously everyone's here to listen to and learn from the views of the panelists. So the less that I speak, I figure the better we're all off. But let me first just offer a disclaimer. You know, what I say, any implied opinions are the opinions of myself alone, don't represent the United States government. So now that that's understood, the idea is that we have posed some questions to the panelists ahead of time, and we're going to go down in order, allowing each panelist to indicate whether they would like to offer their thoughts and comments on that question. And to the audience, you know, while you're listening, taking this all in, we ask you to please start submitting your questions through the Q&A function that should be at the bottom of your Zoom client. So if you could start doing that now, that would be great. We're going to be monitoring it and curating those and making sure that we can get to as many of those questions as we can. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and move to the pre-sent questions. So this goes to all the panelists, and please indicate to me if you'd like to go ahead and offer your thoughts and comments on this. The first one has to do with what is your perspective on not only the state of women's rights, human rights, and the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan since the collapse of the government on August 15th, 2021. And what do you believe from your long years of thought and practice on this is an appropriate way forward in this dramatically changed context? So I see Ms. Ahmadi and then Dr. Sakhi. So let's go in order with that, please.
Thank you so much and good morning. It's an honor to be with such a distinguished panelists today. I'm Belquis Ahmadi. I work with the United States Institute of Peace. My views today are personal and do not represent the views and position of USIP. I know that we all have been saying that everyone knows about the problem in Afghanistan, which may be true, but we may not know the details of the suffering Afghan men, women, and children are faced with in Afghanistan. With your permission, I'm going to briefly talk about the reality on the ground. In preparation for today's panel, I made some calls to Afghanistan and wanted to get their views and ask them what they would like the world to know about their situation. So with no further ado, I'm going to basically rephrase and present to you what I heard over the phone from contacts in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is faced with complex emergency and humanitarian crisis, no doubt in that. The country was already at high risk of drought and famine when COVID hit the country, and then the man-made disaster brought by the Taliban came, which has further complicated the already disastrous situation. So here is what Afghans are faced with since the summer, or I must say since summer, but more specifically August of this year. Extensive loss of life due to bombings, violence, and targeted killing of Afghan workforce that includes civil servants, security personnel, journalists, women, and human rights advocates. Mass displacement throughout the country. Extreme poverty and lack of economic activities. Lack of a functioning government and governance. So in Kabul alone, I spoke with some people this morning and they said there are thousands of men, women, and children now begging on the streets of Kabul. And while Kabul particularly had, unfortunately, homeless and beggars in the past as well, but these days, those educated and professional men and women have also joined, unfortunately, the beggars on the streets. The other thing that was mentioned was environmental problems due to lack of public services and a functioning municipality, which has serious implications for health and environment. For example, waste management is something that Taliban do not have experience. And many of the former government workers and public service providers are no longer welcomed in their jobs. So what I'm hearing is that garbage, for example, is piling all over the city right now. On the other hand, every member of the Afghan society suffers. We all know that, men, but women, children, persons with disability, and displaced people are particularly vulnerable and susceptible to additional sufferings, including domestic violence, sexual abuse, and so on. I'm going to stop here and add additional thoughts later on. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next, we have Dr. Sakhi and then Ambassador Revere.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Veglan, and thank you, Nazila Jamshidi, for organizing this event. All events on humanitarian crisis and development crisis in Afghanistan are very timely, since the international community is trying to develop a policy of engagement, the United States trying to develop policy of engagement on all these issues. So I think these events are really meaningful and have a special place. So thank you for organizing this timely event, and thank you for inviting me here today. It's good to be among such a distinguished panelist today. Well, first of all, it's extremely sad for me to start all the discussion from the scratch. I remember all this discussion when we started doing it in 2002 and 2003, and preparation of the international community's humanitarian development funding to Afghanistan. So it means that we are just reviewing everything back, and everything is starting from the scratch, which is from my experience of working in Afghanistan. It's really a sad moment for me, and to accept that we are going really backward rather than forward. So I categorize actually what Belquis John mentioned. I second with what she said. The situation is really dire in the country. The country is facing two kinds of crisis: humanitarian crisis and development crisis. And of course, the first seat of engagement should be given to address the humanitarian crisis, which is mass starvation, drought, and all other areas that Belquis John has clearly articulated. One of the areas, of course, which comes under both the humanitarian plus the development crisis is the women's issue. And women are actually being more targeted and more victimized, I mean, because of the humanitarian crisis and development crisis. As we all know, Taliban's ideology does not support a women's right in Afghanistan. And whatever policy they develop going forward, I'm really not positive and optimistic about their policies, because their policy towards women is really rely on their ideology that they have, and their ideology by no way favors women's right. They confine women to a particular social class, and they confine women to particular economic class even, which does not let women to move beyond that box, and that by itself disempower women, that impede the empowerment of women, and any activity which I think we envision going forward that will be impeded by the Taliban's policy towards this particular sector, because the policy will rely on the ideology, and ideologies strictly impede women's empowerment and women's movement. So therefore, women will be going forward, even we will see more atrocities towards women. Taliban, I mean, for the time being, if I only take the issue of women's rights sector, they stopped women from the field work. Whatever information I get from the ground, from this women organization who were active at that time and now they are no more active, Taliban literally went to the offices, the NGOs, and they said that no more field work for women. So women are not going to the field. There only men are going, and they also had certain strict rules for the offices where women activities are not promoted much to the remote areas. That's kind of concerning, because that is coming under humanitarian issue when women are not able to reach out to women for providing them health packages or education packages. So that's one thing. So they limit women from work. They're already limited. They had their policies, and they had in the health sector, and maybe they had some flexibility. As we have seen, it differs from province to province, but all other sectors, including education, has been strongly impacted by the Taliban's takeover. Of course, the whole concept of women losing their power, because women have a track record of the Taliban behavior, policies, and governance operation from 1996 to 2001. And that track record already created hopelessness and frustration among women. That's why the women don't want to stay in the country. They want to leave. And of course, they are right in their decision, because they don't see the place for their activities, for their participation in society. So now, just going back to Dr. Veglan, what you said, what should be done, I just highlight a little bit, and maybe we will open for more discussion. I think this is a time for more bottom-up approach. I've been calling this again and again for the last 2-3 months, and different panels and different discussions, and here in the United States and around, that there should be the people-centric policy of engagement from international community, not a state-centric policy of engagement. A state-centric policy of engagement will empower Taliban. And I think there's not time to focus on the state-centric policy of engagement. International community should have a people-centric policy of engagement, and that it will be a bottom-top approach. It will to give more resources and funding or whatever services to the rural population, to the remote areas, to humanitarian organization, to community centers, to organizations who are conducting these literacy packages for women and for everyone. So that bottom-top approach should be supported rather than state-centric support that we had that in the past. I stop here and then certainly will continue that during discussion session. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Ambassador Revere, you were up next.
Well, thank you so much. And let me just say, looking here at the frames of my colleagues on the panel, everyone has done so much over many, many years, focusing particularly on the rights of women in Afghanistan. And I think to bring that to this point where we are today, where we are in the process of seeing regression on so much of that, is particularly troubling. To add to what Belquis said so vividly about the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan as we speak, worsening by the day in terms of starvation, lack of energy with the cold setting in, the tremendous economic dislocation, the fact that there is no income for people, the banks are frozen, you can't get any assets that you had out. It's a really desperate situation. So we have, on the one hand, the need to address this humanitarian crisis. So that's top of the to-do list. And then we have what Niloofar was talking about in terms of the ongoing oppression of women in Afghanistan, women and girls, the heartbreaking stories of educations that have been terminated, whether for girls or women at all levels. The fact that one is confined to their homes, the fact that searches are going on, the fact that those who particularly went up against the Taliban, or as they see it, judges who prosecuted them, women judges, or those who were in the security sector are particularly being targeted. And I think it's all symbolized by moving the Ministry of Women, which so many of us have worked with, to becoming the Ministry of Vice and Virtue, which is where in the previous Taliban rule, the most extreme enforcement, and I don't call it Islam, what they practice. They practice their own radical version of really putting women down in a place that is different from where universal human rights claims the full human dignity of women. So that's our backdrop. And what are we going to do about it? Clearly, the international community is energized. The UN, international organizations are coming in to provide assistance. I think what has to be kept in mind at all times is in all of these efforts, women's inclusion. Women and girls have to be central to the considerations of what's happening. In the distribution of the aid, they need to be part of the planning process. They need to use, as Niloofar said at the bottom, the women's organizations on the ground. They need to be part of the distribution. They need to be part of the decision-making. And the international organizations that are involved in this have to stress that at every inch of the way, as they need to stress the centrality of women working and women being educated and continuing the work that they were doing. I think similarly, in terms of all the tools, political, economic, without recognizing the Taliban, those tools have to be unleashed. The Taliban want to be recognized. They want international recognition, and they want to be seen as players on the international scene. As we know, the UN Credentials Committee is going to be determining who represents Afghanistan. That needs to be factored in terms of making demands on them that go to the heart of women's rights as human rights in all of these things. So I think both the international organizations, the international institutions need to stay focused on this. The Taliban want women in Afghanistan to be invisible. And we have to do everything we can to make them visible and not to get off the front pages and not to ignore what's happening there, and to ensure that they're fully participating in the evolving events to address the realities on the ground. And I think that inclusion, as opposed to excluding them, needs to be first and foremost.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador Rivera, for those comments. Any other panelists want to comment on this at this point, or?
I'll just,
Okay.
yeah, hi. It's great seeing everybody, and under such a terrible situation. Obviously, we can't say enough about how bad things are, because they are. And I don't think they can drift like this because people are starving. I ditto what many of you said, and especially Milan, about, I think we have that one thing, they want to be recognized. We have to make sure they're not recognized under these circumstances. And I think that the foreign aid, which has to get in there, has to be directed by, I assume, the UN, but has to be directed in such a way that they make sure that girls and women are involved and get the aid. This thing about the Taliban wants money, the $9 billion, and the banks have been frozen, but that money is not just government money. Individual Afghans have had all of their money frozen, so they have no cash. This is I can't imagine how difficult that would be. And then they're not paying people. So I would assume almost all classes are in various stages of hunger. So I just think that one thing that it has me very concerned is the story is dropping out of our newspapers. We are trying to keep up with all the Farsi press, et cetera, but I think United States has an obligation to do something positive here. I really think we just can't walk away and have this suffering. And I think somehow we've got to get it back in the newspapers and to be more regularly followed here, because a lot of this is our responsibility.
Well, thank you everyone for those initial comments to the first question. Before we move on, I was just, as I was listening to the comments, I wanted to offer some potential, additional follow-up that just occurred to me. So I heard, this idea of deja vu, right? We've seen this before. Many of these debates occurred previously. And one of the debates that I heard is this tension between bottom-up, top-down, state-centric or people-centric, as Dr. Sakhi said. And so, this reminds me of a debate that occurred at MIT in the 1950s between modernists and community development people. So it's not a new debate, but in this particular context, I was just wondering, what I got from Ambassador Rivera's comments was almost trying to find a way to exercise leverage with the Taliban, which would be more in line, presumably, with a state-centric approach. But that presumes there's something that we're negotiating over, recognition plus something that recognition might lead to. And with Dr. Sakhi's call for more bottom up, making sure that it's going to the beneficiaries, presumably that would reduce potential leverage, just because we're trying to not go through the Taliban. And so there's something less that we're negotiating over. And what struck me was her comment about education, and I think this ties into this in a practical way. The education sector, particularly the formal education sector, was so dependent on foreign aid. And the removal of foreign aid has rendered it, in the formal way, non-existent. And so if the Taliban were to have teachers return absent foreign aid, whether they're female teachers or male teachers, if you're not paying them, is that essentially covey labor or forced labor? I'm not saying that which was right or which is wrong, but I'm just, this is such a dramatically changed environment. I'm just trying to work through the next couple steps of putting this into practice. So I see Ambassador Rivera raise her hand. So I'll turn it over to you.
Well, I think you make some very good observations in terms of where the discussion is, particularly with respect to the emphasis on actors. And I think it's not the exclusion of one over the other. It's not just confronting the Taliban and getting them to do the right things, if that's possible, with the incentives and leverage that we have, but it's also ensuring that the people on the ground are getting what they need and are fully participating in the evolution of whatever is happening at the other level. You know, there's an Indonesian pancake recipe that says you need heat at the top and you need heat at the bottom. And I think that that's what we need here. We need everybody's engagement in the ways that it can be done under the current circumstances. So not to the exclusion of one or the other, but it's clearly critical to be dealing with the Taliban because they are in power. We've got to use the leverage we have. We've got to do it on behalf of the Afghan people, but we have to do it in a way that they are fully engaged. And I think women, particularly to be engaged in the planning and the decision-making and the execution and the implementation is what we have to say constantly. And, you know, there's the image now of governments going to the Taliban and representatives of international institutions going to the Taliban, and they're all males for the most part. I think, you know, at a minimum, let's start with having women also dealing with the Taliban in those meetings and not just providing a status quo that would be appealing to them. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done now, but I don't see how you do it without with the exclusion of the people who've seized power.
Thank you for that. I see Ms. Ahmadi and then Dr. Sakhi.
Thank you. So, here's the situation. Of the 30 plus fundamental human rights recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Taliban are in violation of every single right, particularly of women. I was reading the letter the Taliban's Minister of Foreign Affairs sent to the Congress the other day. And I don't know what to make of it. They are clueless why there are sanctions. So again, I would like to invite them to read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and compare their behavior and the way they treat Afghan people, their own people, and then ask for sanctions to be lifted. So the primary responsibility of any state is ensuring the respect and realization of fundamental human rights of its country's men, women, and children. However, what the Taliban claim to be a government is a group of like-minded men set to govern the country without any consideration in ensuring protection from arbitrary killings. People are killed on a daily basis.
That's right.
For no reason at all. And there is no media. Once used to be a vibrant and somehow independent media in Afghanistan is non-existent right now. The fact that the media is not reporting on it does not mean that it's not happening. So they are governing by arbitrary killings, detention, torture, disappearances. Protection of fundamental rights and life with dignity is almost non-existent in the Taliban's dictionary today. I would like to repeat what Ambassador Rafiq said, that the international community must use whatever leverage they have to make the Taliban realize that there will be and there are consequences to their actions. We do not have to adapt to the Taliban's way of life. It's unacceptable, it's unforgivable that the international community, the diplomats, when they meet with the Taliban, they only go in groups of men. What happened with our values, with our principles? We don't have to bend over. Taliban have to adapt to the way of life in the 21st century. We don't have to go to the Stone Age century and try to please them. There is no excuse for the international community in not including women in their diplomatic engagement with the Taliban. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Sakhi.
Thank you, Dr. Veglan. Let me a little bit elaborate on the issue of state-centric and bottom-up approach. I think we are dealing with a totalitarian system, with an authoritative system, and a regime which, first of all, lack functioning governing system. There is no capability within the Taliban forces to govern. And we have seen from last 3 months, we hear all kinds of news from different provinces that each province have their own governance system in place. There is no coherent, consistent governance system in place in Afghanistan. It's not that they don't want to do. I think it's the inability that exists within the Taliban. Last 2.5 years of the peace process, so-called peace process, there has been a lot of push on the Taliban to give the population, to give the people, to give everyone, international community and Afghans, provide them with a governance plan, economic development plan. And they never provide anything because they lack capability for all this hard technical issue to tackle. Fragmentation within the Taliban, it's another problem right now. I mean, we hear different stories coming up from within them that they are, in terms of policies, in terms of their governing operation of the governance system. Lack of people's trust overall. Let's not forget that they got the power by force. It's not through any political settlement. So they lack that people's legitimacy. They have to gain people's legitimacy if they are claiming for any kind of serious engagement and recognition. Taliban almost from last 3 months, I've closely followed every statement of the Taliban and analyzed that they have limited rationality on almost every development issues, women's rights, education, health. They don't have a concrete plan of action and they have a limited rationality. And overall, the internal legitimacy is an issue. So Taliban, it's an authoritative system which have really some technical issues underneath. So within that system, I mean, we have to be very cautious about the issue of engagement and recognition. Yes, engagement, because there's a delicate line, by the way, between engagement and recognition. What I have been thinking and actually using this statement a lot, that right now, yes, engagement makes sense because of the humanitarian crisis. And humanitarian crisis requires a coherent, consistent plan of action by the international community to address within the next, I was actually a date, 6 to 8 months. So there should be a plan there's a winter going on in Afghanistan, the mass starvation, health issues, all kinds of humanitarian crisis exist right now. So for that, there should be really an urgent, it requires an urgent plan of action. And that engagement makes sense. And again, that engagement should not really, the international community should be careful not to really empower the Taliban at this point, because what we see that Taliban are kind of, they need, as Ambassador Reen mentioned, they are striving for recognition, and whatever step they will be taking, and they are taking right now, it does not prove that that's exactly the policy they're gonna engage with in future. So it may be temporary, it may be for the sake of the recognition, but we never know once they get the recognition what will happen. So there is no guarantee that Taliban, on the Taliban's behavior going forward. Therefore, I think one really has to be really cautious about the engagement component and how to be engaged and at what level to be engaged, and even the recognition, how that go on. And again, my kind of a suggestion would be the focus should be on the grassroots community programs. If we practically and tactically think about the next 6 to 8 months of programming in Afghanistan, humanitarian organization, direct support to them, rather than channeling those support through the Taliban regime. That wouldn't be a good move going forward. And then we have another time to think about all those other issues of engagement, which is the development phase. So there's a humanitarian phase, which right now Afghanistan needs urgent support. And I assume that Afghanistan will need another layer of support, and that is a humanitarian development support, And that will require 5 to 6 years of engagement. And for that, by then we will see how Taliban have evolved, whether they have brought changes in their behavior, approaches on policies, and then that kind of engagement could be discussed at that particular time. But for the time being, a serious engagement with them, serious means kind of recognizing would be a mistake. And again, I don't want to neglect the importance of engagement at this point, especially to address the humanitarian crisis. But my whole concern is the recognition. That's not a good move in this particular time. I stop here.
So I'd like to thank all the panelists for, Dr. Ambassador.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick point on what Niloofar said. I don't think any of us are calling for recognition of the Taliban, far be it. We're just recognizing that they are on the ground in power, and we've got to find some way to engage short of that. You know, I think what led to a lot of this, in my view, is the deal that the United States made with the Taliban. And that unfortunate deal validated the Taliban and didn't validate the popularly elected government, as problematic as it had functioned. It was discounted compared to the Taliban. So we can't get ourselves into a situation like that again. Yes, they're in power now, but we also have to ensure that the engagement is short of that recognition. And I think we can go back to the first time the Taliban were in power. They really wanted recognition. They wanted to be seated at the UN. And the United States, there were, both sides vigorously engaged in this and came down not recognizing them, which was clearly, I think the right thing to have done. But that's an issue again. And the fact that it's in the United Nations, in the Credentials Committee, you're going to have Russia and China on one side. This thing has all kinds of political implications, but I don't think any of us wants to endorse recognition.
Great. Well, thank you, all the panelists, for entertaining my rather silly thoughts. Recognizing that we want to move into audience Q&A as soon as possible, and let me encourage all the audience members to start submitting their questions at this time. I want to just jump on to the third question that I posed to the panelists before we transition into audience question answer. And I admit this area, human rights advocacy area, is not really my core area. I'm more on the development, political violence side. And to throw out there this idea, one of the big luminaries of the political violence field is Stathis Kalyvas, who wrote the book Logic of Violence and Civil War. And even before the collapse in Afghanistan, he was giving an interview for a journal and talking about where do we, as a field of social sciences focused on this issue of political violence, sit, seeing the way things have been going in Afghanistan in particular. Shortly after the collapse, he tweeted, does this situation, should it force us as a field to reflect maybe more seriously on what it is that we, how we think the world works and how we act in furtherance of making it a better version of itself in line with our interests. So with that in mind, and reflecting on this, theme that we get of, deja vu of previous attempts to, advance these objectives in a suboptimal condition in which the Taliban is exercising authority. You see this in some of the declassified documents on the State Department Freedom of Information Act website, where they show some of the negotiation attempts with the Taliban back in the late 90s and early 2000s. I would just, throw to the panelists, how have the events of the past months, prompted any self-reflection on how best to advance human rights in this dramatically changed context? And if you have had a self-reflection on this, would you be willing to share that with the audience? So anyone who would like to take a stab at that, I'll hand it off to them.
I'll take a stab at it.
Great.
Is that I think we have to be very strong that the violence and the killings and the disappearances and everything cannot be accepted in the 2021 by civilized society, and that we cannot we cannot walk away from this without knowing our responsibility. Like Milan Bavir just said, we in this so-called peace negotiations legitimized a terrorist group. And I'm just using it because it's realistic. I mean, they are terrorizing this civilization. In fact, we have been concentrating on trying to get some of our supporters, our people who have worked for women's rights and human rights out of the country because they're threatening to kill them. And they're not just threatening to kill those people, but anybody that worked with the government, anybody that had been in war. These are all violations, by the way, of any kind of covenant on war. I mean, you can't just go and this country has obviously surrendered and kill anybody that was associated with the prior government. That is absolutely opposed to any Geneva conference or anything. And somehow we have got to demand civilized behavior, or they're just slaughters of people. And we have some responsibility for getting those who worked for women's rights, those who were helping on our NGOs for fighting violence against women, get out of there safely. They're threatening to kill all of them. I mean, not just the women that worked in the domestic violence shelters, but even the security guards. I mean, there's no outrage, and I think there has to be, or we sink to lower and lower levels of behavior and we try to legitimize them. There's no legitimizing this behavior. And I feel very strongly that if the public knew exactly what was happening, they would be outraged. And somehow I think we've got to convey that. Now, and frankly, I think we need to do something fast because the suffering is horrible. And it's not just in this country. There's been other countries that have been devastated. You know, the starvation in Yemen and et cetera. I mean, if there's a United Nations, it's got to exert some standards of behavior that, I mean, when we all just calmly say that they're torturing, they're terrorizing, they're killing, they're disappearing, and they're doing it with doublespeak, trying to appear more moderate so they get the money and support and recognition while this is going on. Anyway.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, it certainly does seem that the events can foster a greater emphasis, a greater concern on conviction, for sure. Ambassador Bavir and then Ms. Ahmadi.
Yeah, to follow up on what Ellie said, whether it's self-reflection or it's the reflection of many of us these days, we are all struggling with how we can protect human rights, women's rights in Afghanistan right now, when, as we all know, it's oppression and repression writ large. It's a very difficult time and there are many, many violations. You know, it strikes me at the Georgetown Institute on Women, Peace and Security, we put out an index, a Women, Peace and Security Index. And what it demonstrates is that the well-being of women is tied to the well-being of nations. There's a direct correlation between the condition of women and the condition of nations. And we know what's happening in Afghanistan, what's been happening, and what is now exacerbated is going to create even more fragility, even more failure, even more difficulty. So we have to focus on what's happening to the women. And I think one of the issues that many of us are struggling with is how to monitor these human rights violations in a way that you are getting that complete picture, that you are holding the Taliban accountable, that you are having that kind of case made, not just for accountability today, but for accountability in the future as well, in terms of the price that needs to be paid. You know, the Human Rights Council in Geneva, the UN Human Rights Council has just has adopted a special representative on human rights in Afghanistan. Well, that's fine. It will take time for that to have any impact, but I do think we need a monitoring mechanism of some kind with teeth that will at least give us that understanding of what's going on and then what to do about it. Because again, I go back, as Ellie just said, if you don't see it, it's not happening. And if you don't hold people accountable, they're never going to pay a price. And impunity is not the order of the day, or should not be.
Thank you for those thoughts, Ambassador Vermeer. It reminds me of, I think there was a quote attributed to Patricia Grossman of Human Rights Watch not too long ago, where she noted it's been a flood of accusations of human rights violations, but from where she was sitting at Human Rights Watch, it's been very difficult to validate even a fraction of them. And I imagine you all are experiencing that. And another thing I got a sense from a lot of the comments thus far is it's almost as if each of us are going through the different stages of grief, trying to make sense of this thing that we've tried so hard to not have happen, and yet it happens, and grappling with that and going through it. But
well, if I could add one thing, because I'm looking at Belquis on the screen, and she's been doing so much with the Afghan women, staying in constant touch, how to utilize the mechanism that they afford us from what's happening on the ground, as well as the women who now have been evacuated and are in exile and have those very close ties. There has to be a way to utilize the inside and the outside in terms of women's leadership on this human rights piece, and to ensure that we're getting the full picture.
mm-hmm. So with that, Ms. Ahmadi, and then Dr. Sakhi.
Great. I think there was also a question in the chat group from the audience that they're living in Afghanistan and they want something be done in order to improve the quality of life for them. I think the international community, in their engagement with the Taliban, without lowering our values and standards, insist on any government or authorities' obligations for respect for human rights and life with dignity and so on. And I think it's now, unfortunately, up on the international community to make the Taliban understand and realize that running a state or a country requires different sets of skills and resources than leading a warring faction. They're completely separate, and they must recognize and realize that. The international community must be firm and consistent in its messaging to the Taliban about the consequences of their actions, about accountability, the fact that they are claiming now that they are running the country, which they are, but by terror. They also have to take some responsibility. They must immediately ease up their restrictions on free and diverse media, I believe, because it's through media that we will know what exactly is going on in most corners of the country. Agree on a formation of a diverse and inclusive governance body to include women and minorities. And also announce a time frame for local and national elections. That's the only way, if they really want to be treated as persons or as individuals trying to get the trust of the international community, they first earn the trust of Afghan people. And that can be done by announcing free and fair elections, by easing up all the restrictions that they have been imposing, and also by allowing girls to go to school. There is no logical reason and rationale for not allowing girls over the grade of 7, I believe, to go to school. What purpose does it serve? I would like to call on the governments, states, and their friends and sympathizers in the world to sit down with them and argue with them. have a discourse about all of these issues. On education alone, when they say only at elementary level, girls are allowed to school. Okay, so the next question should be, how are you going to get doctors? How are you going to get people to serve the country? An elementary graduate, an elementary student cannot become a doctor, for example. These are the things that we have to constantly engage with them. And in order to make them understand, I think they have to. There are certain countries, I don't want to name names, who have leverage, who have influence over the Taliban. It's in their strategic and national interest to have a peaceful Afghanistan. The more this show continues that the Taliban has unfolded, we will see more chaos in the region. And that also means chaos in the world. We have seen it, what happened in the 90s and the early 20s. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ms. Ahmadi. And your comment just before I turn over to Dr. Sakhi about the different technologies or techniques that the Taliban employed to win might not be the same that are necessary for governing reminds me of a comment from Dr. Olga Dror, who did a comparative research piece on North and South Vietnam. And one of her conclusions was North Vietnam did what it took to win. So it focused on the war to the exclusion of preparing for the peace that eventually won. Whereas the government of South Vietnam, she concluded, emphasized much more the peace that it did not ultimately win because it insufficiently paid attention to the war. And that just kind of reminded me before I turn over to Dr. Sakhi of that comment. But Dr. Sakhi, please.
Thank you. In relation to Taliban's accountability, I think one of this a tactical way to go forward is that UN should take the lead and create a human rights monitoring committee. They did in certain other countries. I think that makes a lot of sense at the current context of Afghanistan. If that committee is developed and consistently follow up the human rights violations in Afghanistan, particularly issues concerning to women. And there is a talk, by the way, I have been in a couple of other gatherings, there is a talk going on that it might take a shape, I have no idea, but I think that's one thing. I mean, as a systematic platform in place where continuously, consistently monitor the violations in Afghanistan. And then that could be a way to follow up the cases. There should be reporting from Afghanistan, follow up the violation cases and a way to keep Taliban accountable for their deeds. In relation to, my concern now, looking at the short-term and long-term goals of the international community's engagement, and particularly in relation to women's rights, is that that should be a very systematic, consistent engagement. Why? I have a conceptual framework that I want to talk here, that how it's going to impact women's agency of power if that consistent engagement is not there. So what happens in an authoritative system? That authoritative system, they practice certain activities and policies, and those practices becomes normalized among the population. And once it is normalized, even women think that that's part of them. I mean, they are meant for this position. They are meant for this particular role. So that normalization is dangerous if we see conceptually from a feminist perspective. That is dangerous in such a context. And that's why I'm saying long-term engagement is important. I'm saying bottom-top approach is important. I'm saying mobilizing people now, creating discourse among these women groups, whoever is on the ground, the humanitarian organization, community centers, trying to educate them, identify them, creating discourse about women's role, even maybe from a religious perspective. I think that will add value a lot. So just why that discourse creation is necessary going forward in the long term, because to prevent normalization of the policies, and beliefs and ideology that Taliban will impose on society, because that will be difficult then. And then if that policies will be normalized, if those practices will be normalized in a society, then you will be dealing with changing women's ideas and perception about their role in society. So this is a time, there's early time, and there's a good time actually for international community to have a short-term responses, as many of distinguished panelists already talk about, in terms of engagement, in terms of putting more pressure on the Taliban, and then long-term engagement in order to prevent that kind of societal disturbances that Afghanistan might face, especially in relation to women's rights. I stop here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I think it's time that we move on to the audience question and answer section. And been monitoring the different questions, and a couple seem to overlap. So I'm going to collapse a couple and then pose that to the panelists. I hope no one takes that as a indication that we're not taking the question seriously. It's just for the sake of giving everyone a chance. So the first couple of questions I see seem to align well with one that Ms. Ahmadi has already taken an initial answer to. So I'd ask if she could maybe lead us off in describing some of what she was answering. But basically, it's the situation appears very dire for women in Afghanistan in the near term, and whether there are recommendations for them, human rights or women's rights activists, human rights defenders who are still resident in the territory of Afghanistan. And Ms. Ahmadi offered some thoughts also on, kind of the general approach in the near term. I was wondering maybe you could start off with responding to that, and then I'll let other panelists respond.
I cannot explain the dire situation that women are at right now in Afghanistan. They have lost their income. They're living in a state of anxiety and fear, not only for their own lives, but for the lives of their family and their children. Anyone who has had a member of her family in the security forces in the past or in the government is now in hiding. And they are staying with relatives, basically live with a suitcase or with a bag. That is not life. How long are the Taliban going to do that? In the past, domestic violence has increased tremendously. There are no research organizations anymore. Unfortunately, no one is recording that because there are no protection mechanisms in Afghanistan right now, where there used to be organizations, government entities, commissions on the elimination of violence against women, Ministry of Women's Affairs, and many, many NGOs, local, community-based, and international. None of those are now serving women. So there used to be psychosocial counseling, legal counseling to women. That does not exist right now. We must, it's now our obligation. We have moral obligation as international community to put pressure on the Taliban, take them responsible for their actions, to allow women to earn an income, to feed their families, to allow women to seek psychosocial counseling, and allow organizations, NGOs, and civil society groups to provide those types of services. This morning, I was told that one of my contacts told me that he recognized a legal professional, a defense lawyer, begging on the streets. Shame on the Taliban and shame on their supporters for creating such a environment, such a situation that people have no dignity. Taliban are claiming that they have brought peace and security. What is peace? The peace that people have in their graves? That's also peace, right? I think it's now not only in the hands of the international community, but also for Afghan men, religious scholars in Afghanistan. Come on, man, wake up, do your job. Use your ideology, use your argument to improve lives for human beings. That's what religious scholars claim to be doing. Propagating religion and ideology. Men have to stand up for women. When they do that, they should consider, they should visualize standing up for their daughters and for their granddaughters, not only for the neighbors' wives and women. There is a need for mass movement in Afghanistan and mass movement in the international community. Where are all those Muslim scholars throughout the world? Why are they quiet? Is this really the type of Islam, Taliban's type of Islam, is that Islam that everyone believes in? Why are they quiet? There has to be an international movement mobilized immediately, not tomorrow, not next year, in order to address some of the concerns, some of the life-threatening challenges that women and girls are faced with in Afghanistan.
Thank you for that. Dr. Sakhi, you indicated you'd like to speak.
Yeah, one other area that I wanted to highlight in terms of what to do with the Taliban, especially in relation to there's all civil liberties, particularly women's rights, is make them write something, make them draft a policy for all these sectors that they have to deal with. I mean, trusting their words only, it's not an appropriate way going forward, because, for example, I'll give an example of education. There has been now almost more than 3 months, and there are some schools are open for the secondary education of women, some schools are closed. And the reasons that they have, which I always say it's irrational, as well, there's no regulatory framework. Why? The regulatory framework was there. I mean, last 20 years has generated, I think, the better regulatory system for education system to run. Okay, now they have justification that it's not Islamic. The regulatory framework is not Islamic. Well, it was Islamic. They were going with, even girls were going with scarf, which was part of the Afghan culture, and they were wearing shalwar kameez, which was again part of Afghan culture. So what was un-Islamic in that? Again, that's what I'm saying. Their ideologies are the force of developing their own policies. So I think this is a time that international community should push them and force them, if they want really kind of even support to run to tackle with this humanitarian crisis, to have something unwritten, to have some policy of engagement when all these sectors that are concerning for the international community, for many of us, especially on the civil liberties and women's rights. The other area, I think the quota system was a good model when we started in 2002 talking about that. Why not to have that discussion now with the Taliban? So if really it's a matter of conditionality now, okay, this is how many women we want to be in the administration. There's a number of women we want to be in this place. There are hard talks, I agree. There are hard talks. They are hard to even raise this issue at this time. But I think these are some tactical way to go and have them really do something practical rather than by word of mouth saying that we are not against women's rights. As they have been saying in the media, the spokesperson, well, we are not against, but everything should be Islamic. And they have been saying this statement from last 2.5 years. So I think it should go beyond the rhetoric, and it should, this kind of discussion should take some serious policy documenting format where they have to document that and they have to be clear how they will be dealing if they really need a kind of certain kind of engagement of international community with them. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Ambassador Rivera, you're up next.
Yeah, I just want to raise an issue that's not been raised, and that's the fact that, you know, about 60% of the Afghan population and upwards is under the age of 25. You know, the Taliban have not changed, but Afghanistan has changed. And I frankly see a lot of hope, even in this despairing moment that we're all talking about and the experience that Afghans are having, that in that cohort of young people, they're the ones out demonstrating, they're the ones resisting, they're the ones who have been schooled, they're the ones who see a different future for their country. And I just hope that as the international community engages, that we work to ensure that their voices are not going to be submerged in all of this, but that hope will be restored for them. But they are a hopeful sign, as the women are a hopeful sign, given all of the things that they are having to withstand right now that we've been discussing. So some ways that the international community can continue to support those young Afghans who have brought the country to a different place.
Thank you for that. So the next question, I'm going to combine a couple and then pose them to the panel. So I'm getting the sense from the panelists, what they're saying, as well as what some folks are saying in the Q&A. It's almost a combination of, we need to have smarter, more effective international engagement than we believe we've seen over the past 20 years, even preceding the 2001 attacks, while also trying to mobilize people, maybe grassroots, whether that's for surveillance purposes of human rights violations and reporting purposes, when the mechanisms that existed no longer exist. You know, so one person was talking about the International Criminal Court, which had made tentative steps to intervene at various points over the last 20 years. Is that an exemplar of this type of thing? And, you know, looking back over the 20 years, you know, why did the ICC not intervene? Do we see it more likely to do so in this dramatically changed circumstance? And so it seems, you know, one of the things I'm getting from this and from some of the questions are calls for doing what was attempted before, but make it work this time, with a realization that the circumstances are very different. And even the tentative steps and progress made that, you know, was insufficient in many people's minds, relied upon an infrastructure of non-governmental organizations, a state that was supportive, at least in the Constitution and its treaty obligations, which does not exist anymore. And I don't know if that's so much a question, but, you know, just kind of, again, allowing the panelists to react and offer thoughts on that. I'll just throw that out there. Anybody want to say anything?
You know, I think it has to do with learn from your mistakes. And that's certainly a good lesson always. But it also has to do with the fact that we've already discussed, which is there are leverages that can be taken, and there are a whole box of tools that need to be factored in. And I think we do have to be smarter about the pressures that we bring to ensure that these changes do occur, especially before it gets more regressive than it already is. So, you know, there's wisdom in the questioner's comments about, you know, we should learn, but we should use those tools that we've always had and sometimes not utilized.
I mean, I guess this is part of the tension. You know, again, I'm not in the more advocacy realm that the panelists are mostly commenting on around. It's not just the world as we see it, but the world we want it to be. right? And the general sense I get from all the panelists is the world we see right now is not what we want it to be. And I imagine if we had had this panel prior to the collapse, there would have been a similar type of discussion. You know, progress has been made, but challenges remain, and the struggle should continue. And the core motivations to continue that struggle should not be sacrificed due to the realization that the conditions at the moment are suboptimal. And I imagine this is a challenge in the human rights field because it is a mix of advocacy and analysis. So let me, if no one else had anything on that further, I can move on to the next question I see here from the audience. So I see one comment talking about how donors should have monitoring in systems that are more results oriented. And I think certainly looking back over the 20 years, I'm sure all the panelists would have views on how that was prior to the collapse, probably able to identify many deficiencies. But again, this kind of deja vu challenge we face, these are certainly less than ideal conditions for these systems. And I guess the thrust of this comment or question from the audience member is, you know, how do we see this working better now, particularly on ensuring, say, the Taliban does not co-opt or redirect or benefit from these efforts in service of trying to facilitate delivery to the most vulnerable people that you all have emphasized as a critical step in this near term?
Well, that is really one of the questions that everybody's grappling with in this space. It's the issue of conditionality. Should there be conditions on the assistance, whether it's the humanitarian assistance or other kinds of more development assistance, to one, ensure that the Taliban don't misdirect it and use it for their purposes, but secondly, that it go to address the very issues we've been talking about, and that the women have a central role in the disposition and distribution of those resources to ensure that they go to the people in need. Excuse me.
Thank you for that. And, you know, on the issue of conditionality, I just think about the work of Ambassador Vermeer and our colleague, Dr. Daisha Gerard, who's written on this and discusses, you know, the role of if a recipient country is viewed as a strategic priority for the donor, their argument is that this introduces some unique challenges to exercising conditionality, not just in concept, but in practice. So I would direct you towards their work on that as well. But Dr. Sakhi, you have indicated you'd like to add some thoughts as well, so I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I'm also going to refer to some of the literature on conditionality, which says that humanitarian services or assistance should not be politicized, and because it is to address humanitarian crisis, and there shouldn't be condition attached to the humanitarian assistance. That's what we learn a lot from the literature of humanitarian assistance. And I think in current situation, as Afghanistan is facing dire humanitarian crisis, and it's the middle of the start of the winter, I think at this point conditionality would harm the people of Afghanistan, not the Taliban. So, and as I mentioned, every policy, at least for the next 6 to 8 months, should be people-centric. And people needs and their dire situation should be taken into serious account. Maybe there should be some need for compromises, just because to address the people's dire needs and situations. On the development component, I would go, I think, for the issue of conditionality. And because that's the time where the U.S. and the international community could put all the pressure and force and use its leverage. There are all talks about the unfreezing funds and everything else, which is right now people and experts are talking about. I think that shouldn't be a point of discussion at this point, at this particular time. There's no even with the unfreezing assets that will not solve any kind of humanitarian crisis which country faces right now, because there is no regulatory framework to channel those assets. So therefore, that should be the point of discussion at this particular time. The point of discussion is how actually the international community, including the United States and the UN, all convene and facilitate this humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan, where people in the remote areas should be equally benefited from those resources, and women and men from all parts of the country would get those assistance. That should be the major policy engagement and engagement of the world who will be engaged with the country. And yes, again, all conditionality, there will be time for that to be discussed and to be dealt with going forward when we talk about the development. And under development, to be clear, we will be talking about education, health, the infrastructure, and all these other socioeconomic development of men and women in society, civil liberties. Those will all come under the umbrella of development, which needs another time frame to be discussed, and for international community to strategize its future engagement in this particular sector. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sakhi. I see the next. I just wonder, as I was listening to your comments, this issue of trade-offs, I think is really underlying a lot of this. And I do wonder if, as the United Nations Development Program estimates that 97% of the population is below, in a state of poverty, I do wonder, is it so easy in practice to separate humanitarian from development? But I see Ms. Smeal has something she'd like to say.
Yeah, well, we have experience in this. Actually, when the Taliban was in charge last time, there was also a massive drought, and they were throwing women off and girls off the food lines, even when there were families that had no men that could be in the food lines, and et cetera. And what happened is the United Nations said, you have to put women in the food lines, you have to treat them in hospitals, you have to do help girl children just as much as boy children, et cetera. And the heads of the different agencies, UNICEF, World Food Program, and the World Health Organization, put their foot down. And guess what? The Taliban did comply better. And I just think the conditions dictate. I mean, we cannot not. Right now, the Taliban won't let food necessarily, the World Health, the food program operate. In other words, it wouldn't be good if the food program was only allowed to give it to people that the Taliban thought was worthy. I mean, this food aid has to go to Hazaras, it has to go to former governor people, it has to go to everybody. And also those who are the most in dire need. So I just think that they have to put some conditions on. They did it last time and it worked. And so although I don't want to disagree with Niloofar, I respect you a lot, but I do think that that we have to recognize that they can't get away with using humanitarian aid as a lever to make people comply with their dictatorial ways. So all I'm saying is, even to handle the emergency, we've got to set some standards, or that won't be handled. I mean, as Belquis said, people are running, they're hiding, they're afraid to death to come out in public because they're afraid that they're going to be killed. I mean, these conditions are, and I also think the UN itself is worried that its UN workers will be killed. They got to have some guarantee that there's going to be peace enough that if they put a lot of workers inside, that they're not going to be killed in the process, because that's what's, they have done in the past. So whether we like it or not, there has to be some humanitarian, some rules and standards, even to execute a humanitarian plan.
And just to clarify my points, I still think that humanitarian assistance shouldn't be channeled through the Taliban regime. And because I completely agree with you, Ali, we cannot trust the Taliban in terms of the equal distribution of resources, or even if they spend that humanitarian assistance in places where it is needed. So I would, yes, I completely agree with what you said. But again, my focus, when I said that conditionality, according to the literature of humanitarian and all the experiences we have seen in the world, it's not conditionalities and politicization of humanitarian assistance is not something that practitioners are really emphasizing on. But again, yes, the assistance should not be channeled. Humanitarian assistance should not be channeled through the Taliban regime. It should be directly channeled through the people, as I mentioned, the bottom-top approach that I have been arguing since the beginning of this talk. That's the way to go for both the humanitarian development, to address the humanitarian crisis and the development crisis. I stop here. Thank you.
Well, with that, and I apologize to the audience members who posed questions that sadly we did not have the time to get to. But I think that this was a great contribution to what's going to be a continuing debate and dialogue. It's sad to reflect on the past that has so many parallels for the present, but I think the events of the recent past certainly indicate why it's important to really understand these things as much as we can. But with that, I'd like to go ahead and start closing out. So I'd like to thank the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University for generating and producing such an excellent panel. Nazila in particular, I have to recognize her hard work on putting this together. It's not easy. And I appreciate everyone's forbearance in allowing someone so unqualified as myself to be a part of this journey that we all were on today. So I encourage everyone to continue reflecting, thinking, trying and fighting as much as one can, even though the circumstances are so different and so dire. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and close out for today and thank everyone, the audience and the panelists for today. So
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Good
Yeah,
seeing
everyone.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.